When a power-hungry cop faces Chuck Norris in the park, he learns true strength isn't about force, it's about control. What happens next? You won't believe it. Subscribe to the channel, share the video, and write in the comments what city you were from. The late afternoon sun blazed over Independence Park, casting long golden streaks through the canopy of towering elm and cedar trees. The air was thick with the scents of fresh-cut grass and the distant aroma of food carts selling roasted nuts and hot pretzels. The park was alive. Children laughed near the fountains, joggers moved in rhythmic strides, and elderly couples strolled slowly along the winding paths, savoring the peaceful moment. Yet amid the movement and energy, one man remained perfectly still. Seated on a weathered wooden bench beneath the shade of a gnarled old tree, Chuck Norris tossed birdseed onto the pavement with a quiet patience, his sharp eyes watching the pigeons flutter and peck at the kernels. His presence was subtle yet commanding, a relic of strength, a man of battle-worn experience, now content in stillness. His faded jeans, scuffed boots, and simple brown shirt were a stark contrast to the fast-moving world around him. His well-worn cowboy hat cast a shadow over his strong, weathered face, a face that had seen war, discipline, justice, and the consequences of unchecked power. For Chuck, this was peace. No battles, no training, no orders to give or take. Just a moment of stillness in a chaotic world. But peace never lasts where arrogance and power hunger thrive. The steady crunch of heavy boots on pavement shattered the harmony of the park. It wasn't the casual steps of a passing jogger or the hurried shuffle of someone running late. It was deliberate, heavy, the sound of authority asserting itself. Officer Clayton Reed walked with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed his presence alone was enough to demand respect. His crisp, over-polished uniform reflected the glow of the sun, his badge gleamed, his utility belt stocked with every tool of enforcement, baton, cuffs, taser, and firearm, all meticulously placed for efficiency and intimidation. His mirrored sunglasses concealed eyes that held no warmth, only calculation. Reed wasn't a cop to protect and serve. He was a man who craved control. Power to him was not a responsibility, but a privilege, one he wielded without hesitation against anyone who dared to challenge him. And right now, he had found his next target. His gaze swept over the park, skipping over families and joggers, before locking onto the old man sitting alone, unmoving, unbothered by the world around him. Reed's jaw tightened. Something about the man's stillness irritated him. He had seen men like this before, old relics who thought they were above the rules, men who ignored authority simply because they had seen too much, done too much. To Reed, anyone who didn't immediately acknowledge his presence, anyone who didn't shrink or scurry at his approach, was a problem. And problems needed to be dealt with. With purposeful steps, Reed veered off the main path, moving toward the bench. His gloved fingers flexed at his sides, already feeling the reassuring weight of his baton. This wouldn't take long. The weight of authority nearby, a young woman walking her Labrador, slowed her pace, her eyes flicking nervously between the officer and the seated man. At a picnic table, a group of teenagers lowered their voices, their attention drawn toward the brewing confrontation. They knew Reed. Everyone did. And they knew what happened when someone didn't comply fast enough. Reed came to a sharp stop in front of the bench, his broad frame casting a shadow over Chuck. His stance was wide, hands resting on his belt, posture rigid with unspoken authority. Chuck Norris didn't move. The pigeons around him continued pecking at the scattered seeds, completely unaware of the growing tension in the air. Reed exhaled slowly through his nose, his patience already thinning. This was the part where most people looked up, nodded, acknowledged his authority. But this man didn't even glance at him. Unacceptable. Reed's voice came low and firm, sharp as the crack of a gavel. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move along. Can't have people just loitering." Nothing. Chuck dropped another handful of birdseed onto the pavement, watching as the pigeons flapped and scurried. His posture didn't change. His expression remained neutral, his breathing steady. Reed's jaw tightened further. This wasn't defiance in the traditional sense. There was no attitude, no backtalk, no slouching rebellion. It was worse. It was complete indifference. The silence was a slap to Reed's authority, and something inside him twisted with irritation. He wasn't used to being ignored. He didn't like it. He stepped closer, the tip of his polished boot nearly touching Chuck's. The air shifted. The space around them, once just an ordinary part of a public park, now carried a dangerous charge, an almost imperceptible tension that only a few in the crowd could sense. Reed's fingers hovered near his baton, not yet drawing it, but already considering it. "Did you hear me, old man?" His voice carried more bite now, laced with the sharp edge of command. Chuck finally moved, but only slightly. With a slow, deliberate motion, he adjusted his cowboy hat, tipping it back just enough to let the light catch the lower half of his face. It was subtle, but the weight of it, the unshaken control, made Reed's irritation twist into something else. For the first time in a long time, his presence alone wasn't enough, and he didn't know why that made him feel uneasy. His hand twitched toward his baton. A few passers-by paused their steps, watching, waiting. Some recognized the danger. Some just sensed something was about to happen. The silence stretched. A pigeon cooed. A breeze ruffled the leaves. Then, without a hint of emotion, without lifting his gaze, Chuck finally spoke. His voice was calm, carrying no fear, no anger. "I heard you just fine." The words weren't defiant. They weren't submissive. They just were. And somehow, that made them even more unsettling. Reed's grip on his baton tightened. He was going to make the old man move. One way or another, the tension in Independence Park thickened like a gathering storm. The setting sun cast elongated shadows areed the cracked pavement, stretching toward the worn wooden bench where Chuck Norris remained seated, unmoved, feeding the pigeons in serene defiance. The park's usual hum of conversation and laughter felt distant now, drowned beneath the unspoken conflict simmering between the silent old warrior and the seething enforcer. Officer Clayton Reed had expected instant compliance, the kind he was accustomed to, the fearful shuffling of feet, the hasty nods of obedience, the submission that came not from respect, but from intimidation. Yet this old man had given him nothing. No hesitation, no reaction, nothing. Reed tightened his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. His patience was thinning, and his badge, his power, the emblem that made lesser men obey, felt meaningless in this moment. It wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was about control, his control. And Chuck Norris was not playing along. The officer's demand. A few onlookers had begun to notice. A woman clutching a stroller slowed to a stop, her eyes flicking between the officer and the motionless man. A group of young men at a picnic table exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the confrontation brewing. They had seen Reed at work before, knew what happened when someone didn't comply fast enough. Reed's boots scuffed forward, the gleam of his polished leather nearly touching the toe of Chuck's worn-out boots. The pigeons continued their feast, oblivious. The officer inhaled deeply, forcing himself to maintain a facade of patience, though his gut twisted with frustration. "Sir, I won't repeat myself. Get up. Move along." Again, silence. Chuck's hand lifted slightly, reaching into the brown bag resting beside him. For a brief second, Reed tensed, his instincts firing. His grip on his baton shifted slightly. Was the old man reaching for something? Number Chuck merely retrieved another handful of birdseed and scattered it onto the pavement, his fingers moving with the same calm precision as before. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. A cold bead of sweat formed at Reed's temple, but he refused to recognize it. He was Officer Clayton Reed, the law in this city. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was being ignored, dismissed, as if his presence, his authority, was nothing more than an inconvenience, and he couldn't stand it. Escalation. A muscle in Reed's jaw twitched violently. A sharp, loud crack rang out through the air. His baton slammed into the wooden bench, inches from Chuck's leg, the force vibrating through the old wood. Nearby, a flock of startled birds took off in a chaotic flurry of wings, squawking in alarm. Gasps rippled through the crowd. People stopped walking, turned, whispered. A father near the playground instinctively stepped between his child and the unfolding scene, though the boy had already noticed and stared with wide, nervous eyes. The world paused, but not Chuck Norris. He remained exactly as he was, save for a minor adjustment, the slightest tilt of his hat revealing a fraction more of his chiseled, weathered face. His posture never changed. He did not flinch. He did not react. He did not yield. And in that instant, Reed felt something shift inside him. A flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor of his own self-importance. For the first time in years, his power felt hollow. A dangerous line. The officer gritted his teeth, masking the unease crawling under his skin. No, this wasn't over. He had to push harder. The baton in his grip twitched, itching for movement. He didn't want to just intimidate anymore. He wanted to force this man to submit. I said, move. His voice now carried an edge, not of authority, but of desperation. Chuck finally spoke. His voice was low, even, and carried none of the usual tones that men used when they were afraid. And I heard you. Reed's eyes narrowed, something dark flashing behind them. The response had been subtle, but the meaning behind it was deafening. Chuck was not afraid. He was assessing. And for the first time in years, Reed felt like prey. The crowd, grows more people had stopped now, a dozen, maybe more. Some pulled out their phones. Others whispered among themselves. A shift was happening. The power dynamic was tilting. This was supposed to be his moment of dominance, yet somehow the control had slipped from his fingers without him even realizing it. The officer took a measured step back, his breath heavier than before. This was wrong. No one ever stood still when he exerted his presence. No one ever held their ground like this. And yet, Chuck Norris had done so without even rising to his feet. The final straw, Reed exhaled sharply, rage and embarrassment twisting inside him like a coil ready to snap. He would not be humiliated by some washed-up old man sitting on a park bench like he owned the place. His fingers twitched toward his baton again. If words weren't enough, if intimidation wasn't enough, maybe a little physical persuasion would be. But before he could act, before he could make the final mistake of his career, Chuck moved. Not much. Just one hand, lifting from the bag, dusting some of the birdseed from his palm, as if wiping away something insignificant. The motion was so small, so casual, but Reed felt something primal freeze inside him. He had spent years on the force. He had faced violent criminals, cornered men, desperate fugitives, and yet he had never felt more vulnerable than he did now. The crowd was silent, waiting, as if instinctively knowing that something critical had just shifted. Reed's hand stopped, hovering near his baton. His pulse thumped in his ears, loud, uneven. Chuck Norris did not rise. He did not threaten. He did not need to. And in that moment, Reed understood with gut-wrenching certainty that he had no control over what happened next. For the first time in his life, Clayton Reed was at someone else's mercy. And the worst part, Chuck hadn't even lifted a finger. Officer Clayton Reed's fingers trembled as they hovered over the grip of his service weapon. The air around him had grown heavier, charged with something primal and unspoken. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the park, joggers' rhythmic footfalls, the distant chatter of picnicking families, the rustling of wind through the sycamores. Everything had narrowed to this moment. Chuck Norris sat composed, as if none of it mattered, his hands resting on his thighs, his boots planted firm against the pavement. There was no aggression in his posture, only readiness. It was as if he had already predicted every possible outcome, every move Clayton Reed would make, and knew exactly how it would end. Reed could feel the sweat pooling between his shoulder blades, dampening the fabric of his uniform. His grip on his authority, on control itself, was slipping, and he knew it. A dangerous gamble. The crowd had grown, their murmurs swelling, their eyes locked onto the brewing confrontation. Phones were out. The world was watching. And yet, Reed couldn't stop. His pride wouldn't let him. He had been in the force for nearly 15 years. He had commanded order, had bent stronger men than this to his will. But today, here, in Independence Park, a silent old man had unraveled his control without throwing a single punch. And Reed would not accept that. His hand tightened around the gun's grip. The sensation, once comforting, now felt strangely fragile. His training told him this was escalation, that drawing a weapon meant he had no room for error. And yet, his pride demanded it. Just a simple move. A show of force. Then Chuck moved. Not much. Just a flick of the wrist, a subtle shift of weight, the barest tilt of his head. But Reed's instincts screamed danger. The moment stretched thin, elongated, like a drop of water hanging off the edge of a blade. The old man wasn't reaching for anything, wasn't rising to meet the challenge, but somehow the balance had already tipped in his favor. The gun had barely cleared the holster before it was gone. An instant reversal. It happened too fast. 1 second, Clayton Reed had power. The next, he was empty-handed, his gun no longer his own. Chuck hadn't snatched it. That would have implied struggle. No, he had taken it, like a craftsman picking up a misplaced tool, as if it had never belonged to Reed in the first place. The crowd gasped, the shift in energy rippling through them like a lightning strike. The murmurs grew into outright disbelief. Someone cursed under their breath. A teenager's awed whisper cut through the silence. Holy crap. Chuck weighed the firearm in his palm, his fingers tracing its familiar weight. He did not point it, did not threaten. And then, just as easily, he set it down, carefully, deliberately, beside the discarded baton, as if placing down a piece of litter too insignificant to keep. And that was the greatest insult of all. Humiliation cuts deeper than any wound. Reed stared at the weapon. It lay there between them, an object that had once been his last assurance of dominance, now reduced to nothing more than a lifeless hunk of metal resting at Chuck Norris's feet. His chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths, his pulse hammering. He had lost, and not just the gun, everything. Authority, control, fear, and yet the most terrifying thing wasn't Chuck's skill, or his strength, or the eerie, effortless way he had rendered an armed officer powerless. It was the restraint. Chuck had held back. That much was clear. If he had wanted to, if he had chosen, Clayton Reed wouldn't still be standing, and that was why the silence felt louder than any siren. The crowd shifts. Someone laughed, a single, breathless chuckle. Not mockery, just disbelief. The shift had solidified. The power, the control, the fear Clayton Reed had wielded for years was gone, and it wasn't coming back. A bystander muttered. He took his gun like he was taking a toy from a child. Another whispered, "I got it all on video." Reed's stomach twisted violently.
phones. They had recorded everything. His defeat wasn't just seen, it was documented, permanent. The inevitability of what came next hit him like a punch to the gut. If this footage got out, if his superiors saw him disarmed like a rookie by a man twice his age, his career was over. Desperation breeds recklessness number. Not like this. He couldn't let this be his end. His hand lashed out, fingers scrambling for the gun on the ground, but the second his body shifted, Chuck moved. Reed never saw it. He barely even felt it. One moment he was reaching, the next he was weightless, airborne, and then he was falling. A silent warning. He didn't hit the ground hard. No, that would have been merciful. Instead, Chuck's grip had been calibrated, measured, so that Reed wasn't hurt, just repositioned. He landed flat on his back, arms splayed out, staring up at the sky in stunned paralysis. And Chuck Norris loomed over him, his silhouette framed against the glow of the setting sun. The man who had never thrown a punch, but had still won. The consequence of hubris. The whispers spread. The people, his people, the public he was supposed to control, were laughing now, not loudly, not mockingly, but the kind of laughter that came from witnessing something so impossibly absurd, their brains couldn't fully process it. Reed wasn't feared anymore. He was a joke. And Chuck? Chuck didn't even look at him. He simply turned, sat back on his bench, and resumed feeding the pigeons, as if Reed had never mattered at all. The end of an era. Clayton Reed lay there, staring at the sky, feeling the weight of his own downfall. He had spent his life forcing power upon others, but today true power had been revealed, and it hadn't come from a badge, not from a gun, not from force, but from a man who had no need to prove anything at all. And the scariest part, Chuck Norris had never needed to fight because he had already won. Reed had been a police officer for nearly 15 years. He had faced all manner of resistance, angry drunks, cornered criminals, desperate men with nothing to lose. He had been in dangerous situations before, had drawn his gun more times than he cared to count, but this was different. The man in front of him wasn't reacting the way people normally did. There was no fear in his eyes, no tension in his muscles, no telltale shift in stance that signaled preparation for a fight. There was only stillness, an unshakable calm that made the air feel heavier, as though something inevitable was approaching. And his eyes, for the first time, Reed truly met the old man's gaze. They were sharp, unblinking, steady. They held no malice, no arrogance, no smugness, just observation, patience, as if watching and waiting for Reed to make his choice. A strange sensation crawled up the officer's spine, something that felt dangerously close to doubt. He had never felt this way before. His grip on the gun slackened slightly, a bead of sweat sliding down the back of his neck. The world around them seemed to contract. The park, the trees, the people all faded into the background. There was only the heat of the sun on his face, the sound of his own breathing, and those unwavering eyes locked onto his. A voice in his head, quiet but insistent, whispered, "Don't do it." But pride was a dangerous thing. His fingers tightened on the grip once more, and in a single fluid motion he drew the weapon from its holster. Before he could even fully lift it, something changed. The old man moved. Later, Reed would struggle to explain what had happened. He would try to piece together the sequence of events, but everything had unfolded too quickly, too smoothly, as if time itself had momentarily bent around the moment. 1 second, the gun was in his hand. The next, his wrist was seized in a grip of steel. There was no pain, no forceful yank, no struggle, just precise control, the same way the baton had been taken from him. The gun was now slipping from his grasp, and then it was gone. His own weapon, the thing that had always given him the upper hand, now rested in the calloused hands of the man before him. Reed stood there, stunned, his hand still curled uselessly in mid-air, as if his body hadn't yet processed that it was empty. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone gasped. A man muttered a low curse under his breath. The weight of eyes upon him pressed against his skin, heavier than any physical blow. Chuck Norris turned the gun over once in his hand, examining it briefly, as if testing its balance. His face remained unreadable. Then, with the same deliberate motion as before, he bent down, placed the gun on the ground beside the baton, and straightened. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Reed swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The realization of what had just occurred settled over him like a thick fog. He had lost completely, and he hadn't even seen it coming. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his mind sluggish, as if trying to process a new reality that didn't fit within the framework he had always known. He had been trained for physical altercations. He had been trained to subdue, to control, to enforce, but this was something else, a deeper, more humiliating defeat. And the worst part, the old man had never even thrown a punch. Reed's hands clenched into fists at his sides, a flush of heat crawling up his neck. Shame and fury intertwined in his chest. The murmurs of the crowd were louder now, filling the space around him like a pressure he could not escape. A sharp movement caught his eye. Someone was holding up a phone, recording. The realization struck like a blow. This wasn't just an embarrassment, this was evidence. He felt something unravel inside him, something deep and ugly. He had never been in this position before, outmatched, outmaneuvered, outplayed in front of witnesses. And if this video made its way online, no, he wouldn't let it end like this. His body moved before his mind could stop it, fueled by anger, by sheer desperate instinct. He lunged, a last attempt to reclaim what had been taken, but Chuck Norris had already seen it coming. A moment stretched thin between them, heavy with inevitability. Reed moved, but the decision had already been made before his muscles had even tensed. It was not strategy, not skill, just raw, blind instinct. The desperate reaction of a man drowning in his own failure, reaching for control where none remained. He lunged, his body twisting forward in a reckless, uncalculated motion, his hands empty of both weapon and authority, grasping for something, anything, to pull himself back from the abyss he had unwittingly stepped into. But desperation was never a substitute for precision, and precision was something Chuck Norris had spent a lifetime mastering. The silence that followed the senior officer's voice was heavier than anything Reed had ever felt before. The weight of that single word, his name, spoken without anger, without accusation, but with quiet certainty, sent a chill down his spine. For the first time in his career, he was not in control. His badge, his uniform, his authority, none of it held meaning in this moment. The realization settled deep, gnawing at his pride, his very sense of self. The world around him seemed to shrink, the murmurs of the gathering crowd pressing in on him like a slow, tightening vice. Chuck Norris remained still, watching, unmoved by the storm of emotions tearing through Reed's mind. His posture was as steady as a mountain, his face unreadable, his presence commanding without force. He did not need to speak, did not need to justify himself. The truth of what had happened was written in the stunned faces of the crowd, in the hesitation of the approaching officers, in the undeniable fact that Reed had been outmatched, completely, effortlessly. But Reed refused to accept it. His hand curled into a trembling fist. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had power. He had the law. He had the right to enforce order. And yet, standing before this old man, stripped of his weapons, his dominance shattered, he felt exposed, vulnerable, weak.
He turned to the senior officer, desperation creeping into his voice. "You saw what happened. He resisted. He assaulted an officer. The older officer, Sergeant Miles Thompson, simply shook his head. His gaze was steady, but there was something in his expression that made Reed's stomach twist with dread. A silent understanding, an acknowledgement that the situation had spiraled beyond the point of return. Thompson had been in law enforcement for over 3 decades. He had seen officers abuse their power, had watched as their pride turned to arrogance, their arrogance to recklessness, and he had seen the consequences. "Dan?" Thompson repeated, softer now, almost tired. "This isn't the first time, is it?" The words hit Reed like a hammer. His breath caught. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, people shifting, glancing between Chuck Norris and the officers, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. Someone held up a phone, still recording. Reed's skin burned. "This isn't about what happened today," Thompson continued. "This is about every time you let your badge become a weapon instead of a shield, every time you escalated a situation that didn't need escalation, every time you let your ego decide your actions instead of your duty." "No," Reed snapped, his voice cracking. "That's not enough." The single word cut through the air like a blade. Firm, absolute. Thompson's eyes bore into him, and Reed knew in that moment that there was no escaping what came next. "Give me your badge." A fresh wave of heat surged through Reed's body. He shook his head. "You can't be serious. You—" Badge and gun. It wasn't a request. It was a verdict. Reed's breath hitched. His hands clenched at his sides. He could feel the world slipping away from him. Everything he had built, everything he had believed himself to be, unraveling in front of a crowd that would never forget this moment. He had been their enforcer, their authority. Now he was nothing but a man who had lost. For a long, excruciating moment, he stood frozen. And then, with agonizing slowness, his fingers went to the badge pinned to his chest. It felt heavier than it ever had before, as though it carried the weight of every mistake he had ever made. With stiff, jerking motions, he unpinned it and placed it in Thompson's outstretched hand. Then, the gun. As he removed the magazine, cleared the chamber, and handed over his weapon, the finality of it hit him like a collapsing building. He had readed the line, and now he was paying the price. He looked at Chuck Norris, desperate to find something, gloating, smugness, even pity. But there was none, only calm. That was the worst part. Thompson gave a small nod, as if he had expected nothing less. Then, turning to the younger officer beside him, he spoke the final words that sealed Reed's fate. "Escort him out of the park." Reed's jaw locked. His face burned with humiliation, but there was nothing left to do, nothing left to say. The younger officer hesitated, then stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. It wasn't forceful, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. Move. Reed did. The walk to the edge of the park was the longest of his life. The murmurs of the crowd followed him, whispers of disbelief, of satisfaction, of justice. He kept his head up, refusing to acknowledge them, refusing to acknowledge the phones recording his every step, the evidence of his fall. He had always believed himself untouchable. Now he was nothing. Behind him, life in the park resumed. A few people shook their heads, some exchanged glances, but most moved on. It was over. And at the center of it all, Chuck Norris remained where he had been from the beginning, seated on the bench, unshaken, his presence more powerful than any weapon, any badge, any display of authority. As the last traces of Reed disappeared from sight, Chuck let a handful of birdseed fall from his fingers. The pigeons fluttered back, unbothered by the spectacle that had unfolded around them. The sun was beginning its descent, the golden light casting long shadows around the park. Justice had spoken, and the world, as it always did, moved forward. The world seemed to hold its breath as Officer Dan Reed stood motionless, his once unshakable authority shattered. His mind raced for an escape, a way to claw back control, but it was slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. He had spent years using his badge as a weapon, mistaking fear for respect, mistaking submission for true power.
And now, in the face of a man who exuded real strength, calm, unbreakable, and unafraid, he was nothing. The senior officer held his gaze, his weathered face unreadable. "Dan, it's over." The words struck harder than any blow. Reed could feel the weight of the moment, the judgment of the crowd pressing down on him. Phones were still recording. His humiliation would not be confined to this park. It would spread, a wildfire of disgrace, immortalized in digital memory. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to deny what was happening, but the truth was undeniable. He had overstepped, he had lost, and he had done it all in front of witnesses. His hands trembled as they reached for his badge, the symbol of power he had wielded with impunity for so long. But as he unpinned it, it no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a shackle he had willingly worn. He placed it in the senior officer's outstretched hand, his fingers lingering on the metal for just a second too long, as if by holding it he could somehow rewind time. Then, with a deep breath that tasted of bitter defeat, he let go. The gun was next. It had always been his final trump card, the thing that ensured compliance, the thing that had made him feel untouchable. Now it was just another piece of metal stripped of meaning. Slowly he ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and set it down beside the badge. The sound of it clicking against the metal was deafening in the silence. The senior officer nodded once, then turned to a younger officer. "Escort him out." Reed's stomach twisted into a knot. His feet felt like lead as he turned away from the man who had undone him, from the crowd that had seen his downfall, from the quiet legend who had never needed to raise a hand. The murmurs grew as he walked, their meaning clear. He had been powerful once. Now he was just another man. Every step toward the street felt heavier, a funeral march for the career he had torched with his arrogance. The world had changed in an instant, and he no longer belonged in it. Behind him, life in the park resumed. Conversations picked up, laughter rang out again, children played, and people moved on. The world didn't stop for the fall of one man. But in the center of it all, Chuck Norris remained as he was, unshaken, unaffected, as if none of this had ever been about him. Because in truth, it never was. The people who had gathered weren't just witnesses, they were part of something greater. They had seen the abuse of power firsthand, and they had seen it undone not by violence, but by sheer, undeniable truth. And as Reed disappeared from view, they looked to Chuck with something more than admiration. They saw him for what he was, a reminder that true power did not come from force or intimidation, but from discipline, self-control, and an unshakable moral compass. Chuck did not bask in the attention. He did not acknowledge the murmurs or the eyes still fixed upon him. Instead, he did the same thing he had done before. He reached into his pocket, pulled out another handful of birdseed, and scattered it onto the ground. The pigeons, unconcerned with human affairs, fluttered back to him, pecking at the kernels without hesitation. In the end, nothing had changed for him. He had not needed to prove anything. The world had simply revealed itself. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden streaks over the park, justice had spoken, not in shouts, not in violence, but in the unshakable presence of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to teach. True power does not lie in authority, weapons, or intimidation. It lies in self-control, wisdom, and the courage to stand against injustice. This story serves as a stark reminder that abusing power for personal dominance only leads to downfall, while respect is earned through integrity and service. In today's world, where authority is often misused, we must demand accountability and stand united against oppression. Strength is not in force, but in restraint, not in fear, but in justice. Power should protect, not suppress. In every community, when people stand together for what is right, truth will always prevail.
If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe Undercover Insights channel.